Level mechanics suck. That's the main headline, but I do have other things to talk about as well. So, hi, my name is Jouni Vilkka, and this is my channel, TFF Teacher from Finland. This is gonna be a bit different from what I usually do, because this time I'm going to be talking about game design, especially mistakes in game design, mostly role-playing games, tabletop, real role-playing games, and video games using role-playing game mechanics. Some of this even applies to first-person shooter type of games, or shooting games in general. And even writers of fiction might benefit from some of my points in this video. If you are a game designer or want to become one, but especially if you are a game master in a role-playing game, then I think I have something to say that you might already have thought of or not. You might find it interesting. I hope so anyway. I was originally motivated to make this video because I was playing the game Elder Scrolls Online, which is an old game and makes most of the mistakes I'm going to be talking about here. But it's not the only game that does that. Even more recent games actually make many of these same mistakes. Even games of very different styles, like Gloomhaven, for example. I'm going to be breaking this whole thing into 4 sections. The first is about the rules of the game, the mechanics, and that is the section in which I will be talking about the problems with level mechanics. And the second is about world building and story, where I will be especially talking about magic and equivalent technology. The third is about things like weapon, armor and other equipment in the game. And the fourth section is about video game mechanics specifically. First off, the rules of the game, regardless of the type of the game, in my opinion, should be understood as the physics of the game. Physics here in the sense Aristotle understood it, as far as I know, meaning how the world works. And the point is that the rules of the game should be the same for all the characters, players and other characters in the game, and consistently so, because inconsistency makes it difficult to suspend your disbelief, which is necessary in all kinds of fiction. You can see this, for example, in how in role-playing games the player character has stats or characteristics like strength, dexterity, charisma, whatever. But it's not only the player characters who should have these characteristics. All beings in the game world should have them. For example, the whole Elder Scrolls series seems to be made so that only the main character that is being played really has those characteristics, and that doesn't really make much sense. It should always also be possible to alter or temporarily or permanently change those stats in different ways. For example, by getting injured, that should affect some characteristics, and also training, for example, training strength clearly increases strength, and the same goes for everything. Even some games that accept, like for example RuneQuest, which is the game I've mostly played in my life as a game master especially, it has 7 different characteristics, one of which is intelligence, and for some reason, at least if I remember correctly, it does not allow improving that characteristic. That's kind of weird, and I don't quite agree with that. Also, game mechanics, typically, even like shooting games, have things like hit points done in various ways. They might also have other similar stats like magic points or mana and fatigue points, for example. Or they might go by different names, but the idea behind them is the same, and you can pretty much guess what those are just by the name of the thing, like fatigue, hit points, whatever. These are pretty difficult concepts to avoid in creating a game. Out of the three things I mentioned, hit points, magic points and fatigue points, only the last actually really makes sense. The concept of hit points, for example, is pretty weird if you think about it. Like, how many hit points do you have? And how do you get more? And of course there's all the weird stuff about healing by just drinking a potion or something. You know, that might work in your world, but at least if you are trying to create a believable, realistic game, you might wanna rethink that. So other games like Harn, for example, don't really have hit points in the same sense that most games do, but instead use an injury system where different kinds of injuries can be sustained, and so you mark down the type of injury and how bad it is and things like that. That's one way to approach the problem with hit points. But you can perhaps think of something new and even better. One thing then, if you do try to come up with something new, is that you have to try and figure out what it actually even is that these concepts like hit points are supposed to simulate, because it's about trying to simulate something. It's obvious that there's only so much damage that our physical bodies can take, for example, that we can get injured in various different ways. But, you know, after getting enough punishment, we are going to die. So how do you deal with that? Is your hit point mechanic supposed to be just simulating our physical injuries, or is it supposed to also somehow simulate health? Perhaps even the psychological ability to resist pain? These are things you need to think about. Bleeding, for example, is an important aspect of this, and very few popular games have any kind of mechanic for bleeding, or certainly they don't have anything resembling a realistic system for bleeding. Yet bleeding is probably the most important aspect in injuries. For example, if you think about things like stabbing or gunshot wounds, it's usually bleeding that leads to death. Just trying to simulate the damage of an attack by giving a number of points of damage to the character being stabbed, for example, which then somehow remains at the same level constantly until healed. That makes very little sense, because if you are stabbed, you start to bleed, and if you do nothing about the bleeding, then you'll bleed out eventually. Or maybe if it's a minor cut, then maybe you won't bleed out because the wound will close itself eventually. But again, things you need to think about. And what about internal bleeding? That's especially rarely addressed in any way. And when you heal damage from characters, it's also kind of weird how they can somehow regain those hit points or whatever, and it's as if there was no injury in the first place. how does that really work? This leads to the concept of dying, which also is very unrealistically done in practically all games, because especially if you have a hit point system in the game, a character might have like 50 hit points, and then they get damaged like 5, maybe 10 points at a time, and once they get that 50 points of damage, then they suddenly drop dead. And if they don't get 50 points, if they get only 49 points of damage, then they survive, and then they can probably pretty quickly heal to full health again, and it's like nothing happened. That's really stupid. And even if you think about it from a narrative point of view, like from the point of view of a story, would you like to watch a movie that does that? Well, maybe you do. A lot of movies actually do have similar things in them, but those movies suck. If a book has something like that in it, you know, it doesn't really make sense unless that hit point mechanic is supposed to simulate something I don't understand. I don't know. But anyway, you need to think about these things if you are designing a game. Like treating injuries. It rarely makes any sense. I can understand that you can stop bleeding, obviously, if you somehow miraculously regain your health immediately when being, for example, bandaged up by other people. That doesn't really make any sense, because you still have those cuts. You might have severed tendons, you might have dislocated shoulders or whatever, and even if your shoulder is put back in, it's still not gonna just work perfectly right away, and you definitely are going to feel pain for quite a while afterwards. Again, think about these things. Of course, a lot of games even have this really strange mechanic where you can just eat stuff to regain health, and you can even do this in the middle of a combat. And then the magic point things, sometimes called something like mana, but the idea of course is that there is some limitation to how much magic you can do, which makes sense if the magic used in the game has been thoughtfully integrated into the game world. So if you are trying to design a world, a fantasy world for example, where there is magic, then you need to think about how that magic works. And does it require some kind of internal capacity to hold a certain amount of magic, for example? By the way, mana, the concept originally, was nothing like how it's being used in games. Again, a lot of things to think about, like what is magic, how does it work in your world, and what does it require? Is there some kind of energy that is required, and does it come from within the magic user, or perhaps from without, from the ambient world outside? You know, there might be different levels of magic in different places, which might be a interesting concept for any kind of story, and it's something that peoples around the world have usually had, this idea that certain places are kind of like more sacred, more magical, and others perhaps more mundane, even anti-magical. The rules of the game are important, and like I said, I've always thought about them as the physics of the world, but they can also make the game a bit too mechanical, perhaps in some cases, and that can make the game lose some cool factor, I suppose. Dungeons and Dragons comes to mind as an example of this, and that leads to the big topic of this video, the problems with level mechanics. So what is a level? What level are you? Obviously there are no such things in the real world. So it's a game-based concept. I think it originally comes from war games, which I understand Dungeons and Dragons actually was in the beginning. Or at least that is the origin of this game and other similar games. The main problem, perhaps, with Dungeons and Dragons and other games that have level-based mechanics is that the levels have nothing to do with what the character has been doing. So if you just somehow rack up those experience points and increase a level, and you happen to be a fighter or a magic user, whatever, you gain levels in that class, and that class might have nothing to do with how you got those experience points, how you got those level ups. So that makes no sense, and that is what I mostly hate about level mechanics. This is opposed to skill-based mechanics. Skill-based like RuneQuest, for example, or Call of Cthulhu, which is also one of my favorite games. So if your character does something that requires a certain skill, say horseback riding, if they use that skill, if they practice or just have to ride a horse, for example, then their skill in horseback riding increases, perhaps, not their skill in fighting or casting fireballs or whatever, you know. So that is the point. If you want your game to be anything like resembling realistic, then it should have some kind of skill-based mechanic, in my opinion. One problem with those levels, as used in Dungeons and Dragons, for example, is that they only have to do with fighting. For example, if you level up, you increase your hit points and your chances to hit an opponent in combat, and possibly it makes other new combat options available to your character. Even if you are playing a magic user of some kind, then a level up means that you get access to new spells that are combat oriented typically, and it has nothing to do again with what you have been doing. So if you play a wizard, for example, it might make sense that when you learn new magic, new spells, you learn them by studying certain kinds of magic. So you learn that stuff. You don't learn some random ass fireball spells or whatever. In some games where the level system is only used to, and I'm talking about computer games or video games, where the level mechanics are really supposed to only describe the character being played, it might make sense for a level mechanic to be used, because it might be that the character being played is somehow very special, like, I don't know, some kind of divine entity regaining their powers. I think this may have actually been used in some game. So the idea is that you play a character who does not remember that they are some kind of god, for example, but then they are slowly regaining their powers, which makes then sense why those powers are what they are, why they are perhaps combat oriented, for example, and why they learn those specific spells or magical abilities or whatever. In some other games, like Mountain Blade, for example, they have a better, in my opinion at least, a better level system, because instead of all the various stats like ability to hit, the hit points and whatever, instead of all of those being increased every time you level up, in Mountain Blade you have to choose what you want to level up specifically. So you might want to get some more hit points, but then that's all you get. You might want to become a better rider, and then that's all you get. So that's more interesting in my opinion, although it still has nothing to do with what your character has been doing all the time you have been playing, so it's not the best. In fact, I think Elder Scrolls games have some kind of skill-based mechanics as well, so I have played most of those games. They are not just complete crap, although Elder Scrolls Online is pretty much. Importantly, whatever mechanic you are using, in my opinion, it's kind of dumb if it only has to do with fighting and improving your fighting ability or the ability to cast fireballs or other combat-oriented magic. There should be far more versatility, and RuneQuest and Glorantha, the world RuneQuest originally was set in, are good examples of how to do magic and mythology. Maybe you wanna check those out. One really big problem with level systems is that it's really hard to figure out how training would work with that. How do you get experience points from training, for example? How much do you have to train to level up? Can you do that? I don't think any game has any kind of mechanic for this. Let me know if you know of a game like that. One of the things I mostly hate that are not just this level mechanic itself, but very often go with the level mechanic, is level scaling, and that is one of the dumbest things I've ever heard of. The idea, of course, being that as you level up your character, then your opponents also become that much more difficult to beat or whatever. It certainly makes the whole thing very solipsistic. You level up your character and the whole world around that character suddenly changes in a level scaling system. And what that means is effectively nothing changes. Your character does not become significantly better than the other characters around them. So what is really going on even? Usually it just makes the game more complicated by adding other factors and stats and abilities and feats and whatever. And that's just cumbersome, and it, I don't know, sucks the joy out of the game, at least for me. So if you have any kind of level mechanics, at least don't use level scaling. The whole point of leveling up is that your character should be getting better and better in comparison to the average person of the street. Also, other characters in the game should be able to level up as well. So I'm not saying that everything should remain the same in the world and only the player character is somehow leveling up. That might make sense if there is some kind of divine story behind this whole thing, like I mentioned. Like if you are playing an amnesiac god, then fine, then the rest of the world doesn't have any levels and stays essentially the same all the time. But otherwise, if you have a level mechanic, then the same rules should apply to everything and everyone, all the player characters and all the non-player characters. So the other people in the world should definitely also improve their abilities and level up once in a while, but not because the player character is leveling up. It might even be that some important characters are leveling up faster than the player character. So that could be something to think about and maybe even use in some game. Hit points are tied to levels in Dungeons and Dragons, for example, probably for the reason that there is no defend mechanism in the whole game, which is one of the weirdest things about Dungeons and Dragons, because you improve your abilities to hit your opponents as you level up, but there is nothing you can do to improve your ability to defend against the attacks you receive, which is a huge omission. The only thing you can do in that game is to get better armor and shields and magic equipment and stuff like that. It sucks. Whatever mechanic you have, of course, you should also include a way to defend yourself. And finally, the last point I want to say about level mechanics is that for some weird reason, a lot of games recently, from at least Assassin's Creed, so Odyssey onward, and probably other games have been using that even earlier, a lot of games now seem to have this stupid, really dumb idea of having level requirements for things like weapons and armor and whatever gear. And that usually makes no sense, because if you think about a weapon having a requirement of essentially a skill, what you're saying is that weapon is so difficult to use that you have to be a master to be able to use that. When in reality, if the weapon is particularly good, then it should be easy to use. It makes no sense to have requirements of certain level there. It only makes sense to have this kind of level requirement again in the Divine Amnesiac story. If the level somehow means some kind of power level of that god in some weird metaphysical sense, then it might make sense. But it is so far removed from realism that you should not use it. Moving on to world building and story. In general, I think more realism means a better game. That applies both to how the game mechanics, the rules of the game, work, and how the game world is designed. So the game that is being experienced by the player, how does that really work? Is it realistic, or is it very fantastical, or otherwise weird? Making things too fantastical may backfire pretty easily. For example, the towns in the game should not be unnecessarily complicated, somehow weird, like multi-level constructions that really only just confuse the player who's trying to navigate through that town. Games like Elder Scrolls Online and 7 both have examples of this. More detail is better, obviously, than empty space. Like in my experience, the early Mass Effect games, for example, could have been a lot better if they had put a little bit more effort on the locations, because at least I recall them as being very uninteresting, dull, like empty places, and that's always a problem. No real place is like that, or at least they are very rare. Usually there is something interesting wherever you look, and that means realism of a kind. Just look at how places are actually built. What are they actually like? And if you are making a kind of historical game, then there's a lot of historical information available that you can use. For example, look at how you create the maps for the games. You can make realistic maps and instead of like dungeons in the way that, for example, Elder Scrolls does, because in it's a cliche even in Elder Scrolls. All of the dungeons, which is a dumb concept, but anyway, all of those dungeons have a one-way door, mysteriously, that you can only open from one side, and always an exit at the very end of the dungeon, which makes no sense because obviously then that would be another entrance as well. So don't make maps like that. Also, repetition is boring, and if you are designing a video game, then again, like Elder Scrolls Online, becomes boring really fast because all the places are pretty much the same. It may have dozens and dozens of different locations, but only less than a dozen different locations. An open world in general is far superior to a more restricted one. In the worst cases, a game, even a shooting game, becomes boring and stupid and not really that much of a game if it's really just a railroad, if you only have one way to go, because there's nothing else open for you. So instead, you should have an open world. I've been playing the Sniper Elite series recently, and Sniper Elite 2 is really a railroad game. It's not a very good game, whereas 4 and 5, especially 5, is a really good game because it has an open world. Even the 4 has an open world, but 5 is otherwise better as well. But anyway, an open world can still have a linear plot, which is not great, but at least it gives the ability to the player to choose the order in which they do those various things that they need to do. But again, the game world, the area, the map, whatever you want to call it, where player characters can move around and do their things, that should be open, but ideally also the story should be open, not railroaded. Exploration is, at least for me, one of the main things why I play role-playing games, I mean video games especially. And Elder Scrolls games are typically very good for that. I enjoy, or at least I enjoyed the early games when I first encountered them, the opportunity to just explore, walk around the world and explore it. That can really be the focus of game design, and sometimes I guess it is, and it certainly should be one of the focuses. Games like, especially role-playing games, but in my opinion pretty much all games, are only games because of the ability to make choices. In some games that are at least sold as games, they really are not games, but rather interactive movies, and those suck. So the player should always have the ability to make significant decisions, and that involves, in role-playing games especially, also dialogue options when they are communicating with the NPCs of the game world. If the game does not have meaningful dialogue options, like Elder Scrolls Online typically does not, then the player has very little motivation to even pay attention to those dialogues. And because why would you? Because you can't change anything. Why would you care? So all that voice acting is wasted essentially. Role-playing games are about getting into character, to playing a character. So there should be options that make it possible for you to get into your character, the character you are playing. You are acting a character in these games. That's the point. So the more options, the better options you have in the game, the better. Of course it means more designing for designers, video game designers, but that's what you do. it is better to focus on quality rather than quantity. It's far better to have just a few meaningful discussions, but then they are actually meaningful, rather than have a lot of pointless apparent discussions where you don't really get to choose anything, or that are just otherwise dumb. In some games, like I think Knights of the Old Republic, they did this one thing very well, which is to have various different options for saying even the same thing, but as either an honest statement or a lie, because those are obviously different things, and in role-playing games those should matter. And yeah, the consequences of those choices, they should always be significant. They should carry over to future communications, especially with the same individuals. And they might even have influence to the game more generally. A game is not a novel or a movie, and so if you want to tell your own story, I suggest you write a novel or make a movie, and don't make something that you call a game. Because the point of role-playing games, where it's unfortunate that the word game is even in the whole thing, but the point is not that there is one person telling the story and the others just experiencing it. The point is to tell the story together. So in a video game, the player should be telling the story to some extent. The more they can influence the story, the more they can make it their own, the better, obviously, I think. So that means not just having a bunch of alternative endings at the very end, where you can save the game and then try all the different endings, because all the significant choices are only at the very end of the game, which doesn't really make any sense. It's then a bad game. But the different endings of the game, I guess these days better games do it so that your choices throughout the game matter. Like for example, Fallout games have various different choices throughout the game that then you can see playing out at the very end. So that's good. Monster, and especially monster race, is a stupid concept, especially as they are used in games like Dungeons and Dragons, for example. If you have a fantasy world with these different races, although species would be a better term, I guess, like humans, elves, goblins, orcs, whatever, all of these can think of all the others as monsters. They are not metaphysically different. For example, RuneQuest, again, does a great job of explaining these different races of beings and their different viewpoints and so on. And it also presents some unique entities as monsters. And that's the point, because they are unique individual entities. They are not a species of monsters like orcs in Dungeons and Dragons, for example. You can play a character of any species in RuneQuest, assuming that the game master decides that you can, but there is no game mechanical reason, as there is in Dungeons and Dragons, for example, where you can only pick from a couple of different races. I mean, there's like a dozen different options these days, I guess, but anyway, you get the point. There should not be any kind of metaphysical category of monster species. And all the NPCs, so the non-player characters as well as the player characters, should be treated as individuals. And that is also a storytelling point, because it adds to the depth of the story. it makes it more believable and more interesting. So instead of having just a bunch of brigands, for example, attacking the player characters for some weird reason, you can have a bunch of people, and you can think of the stories of all those individuals in that group of brigands who then have some reason to do what they do, and as a game master or designer you need to think of these things in advance, of course. In video games, spawning monsters is the worst. It definitely means that none of these spawned monsters is an individual. It could be used in an okay way, perhaps in a situation where there is supposed to be a kind of an overwhelming number of people in attacking horde of, I don't know, Mongols, which surpasses the computer's power, so that the computer cannot actually just run that many individual characters in the system. So you need to have some kind of limit to how many that you have on the map simultaneously. So you spawn more as the computer memory allows, essentially. So that's a possibility, but it's rarely done right. The concept of monster may be dumb, but boss monster is the dumbest ever. It's also the most irritating. It's what I pretty much hate in all games. Like, I actually quit Doom because of the stupid boss monsters. Otherwise the game would have been good. But there is no reason, normally, perhaps there is in Doom, but usually there is no reason why a boss would be enormously tougher as a fighter as compared to their underlings. I mean, think about a medieval king. Like, how likely was a king to be a really good fighter? Some of them were, probably, when they were young, but if an old king is still somehow a serious opponent, and especially far more serious than their best knights, then it makes no sense. Just because someone is a superior in a hierarchy does not mean that they are superior because of their fighting ability. It's probably because they have other skills that are more useful and enable them to get those power positions. Or maybe they just were born into the right family, as is most likely the case. In video games, boss monsters typically have these unique combat mechanics that are, completely different from the regular mechanics of the game. Even their injury system can be completely different, and that breaks apart the whole idea of the game mechanic. Like, that was supposed to be the physics of the game, how the game works, and suddenly things are different now with this boss monster. It's just annoyingly stupid. Usually it means that there's a stupid trick the player has to do to attack these boss monsters. And that might make sense to have in a game. Something that you can do once, and that can enable you to defeat your opponent. I mean, it really would make sense in a lot of situations, but as it is usually used in these games, is that there is a trick that you need to do, but you need to do it over and over again, and that is frustrating and stupid and annoying. And let's move on to magic or equivalent technology. In fantasy games there's magic, and in science fiction games there's typically some kind of technology which actually works kind of like magic. And of course there's the saying, I think by Clark originally, that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. I don't know about that, but games usually use these two as pretty much interchangeable. For example, Horizon Zero Dawn does this rather nicely, and 7 uses the same idea as well. The most common problem with the use of magic or technology, anything weird like this, is that the author of the story, the narrator, the game master, the developer of the game, whatever, they overdo it. It is so easy, unfortunately, to do it. Game masters do it all the time, and game designers do it all the time as well. Pretty much all Dungeons and Dragons games do it from the very beginning onwards, and it really ruins the game. What I mean is overcrowding the world with magic, for example, means that magic is not weird in that world. It's normal everyday thing now, and that's not supposed to be the case, right? If you have a lot of magical objects in the game, what is their value for the player, for example, or for the characters in the world? The more you have of anything, the less valuable it is. Inflation, you know. So make sure that you don't overuse these fantasy elements. It goes for a lot of more things, not just magic. For example, if you want to have special encounters with weird beings, like monsters or whatever, then don't have a lot of monsters in the game. The fewer you have of them, the better it emphasizes their impact to the story. And the same goes for all kinds of magic things. So magic items, for example, should be really rare in the game. That would make them special and desirable, valuable. The more there are, the more it dilutes their significance. And the same goes for all kinds of spells and whatever things you have in that world. Instead of increasing the number of the magical things, the spells or the objects or whatever, throughout the game, you should consider increasing the importance of those magical things that you have and their specific powers. For example, you might have an object that is magical in some way, but perhaps don't reveal everything about it at once. When the players learn more about it, perhaps they will learn how to use other magical powers that it has, for example. And that would make it far more interesting again. In general, by the way, don't just reveal things. Like they say, show, don't tell. It applies again also to magic. Don't just give a mechanical explanation for how some type of magic works. Rather, describe it more vaguely, and it becomes more enjoyable, at least more interesting in the game. The skills of the player characters, of course, should influence how they use at least their own magic, but perhaps also the items that they use. That's the one case where some kind of level requirement might make sense, but not for the object as a whole, but rather to the different options of how to use that object. You know, like a magical sword might be easy to wield, it might be effective, but then when you learn more about the secret magic in the sword, you might learn about its specific weird powers and other things related to it. Power sources for things like magic or some kind of science fiction tools or whatever can be expendable. Some games use this in some ways, but not so that the object itself becomes useless after limited set of uses. Maybe it makes sense in some cases to have a limit to the number of uses, but usually it makes more sense to have a power source that has the ability, for example, a certain amount of magic points that can be used, and maybe they don't automatically regenerate those magic points themselves. Somebody can reload those magical or technological power sources like batteries. Capitalize on the mysterious in general. Don't reveal things. Slowly allow the player and their character to learn the secrets. That makes the story far better. Magic can easily become too mechanical and kind of boring, but you can perhaps make it better by adding some randomness to make it less mechanical. That might not work so well with technology, because it might not make sense for technology to be random. I don't know. Different places, like I mentioned already earlier, could have different influences of how magic, for example, works there. If you use technology as an alternative to magic, or you have a science fiction story and you don't want to have magic in the story, and you have weird high technology, for the story to be believable, I think your technology should be somewhat within the current understanding of what is possible. You can't just say, because science, that doesn't really work. Like, you can't have things going faster than the speed of light, for example, in a science fiction story without some weird explanation for it. Just saying that it just is kind of, it might be necessary for your story, but then it's kind of a problem already. Whether you are using magic or technology as the means of having something weird in your story, when you are developing your world, you should think carefully how that magic or technology would affect that world. This is a pretty basic world building principle. So for example, if you have some kind of teleportation readily and easily available in the game, like there is in Elder Scrolls Online, for example, teleportation places all around the world, then how come only the player character is using them? It makes no sense. Of course, if you have these weird teleportation circles or whatever, portals all over the world, that's going to really change pretty much everything in the world. You need to think about what the consequences will be. Perhaps even more so if you have the ability to cast some kind of teleportation spells. How would the people in the world use that kind of magic? The same goes, of course, for all the creatures in the world. If you have flying monsters attacking everything in the world, how would that affect, for example, construction? What kind of buildings would the people be living in? Would they be building their towns in the open? And so forth. Think about how whatever you use in your world, how would that affect the rest of the world? Of course, if you have suddenly appearing things in the world, like you have real magic appearing for the first time in that world, and it has not had magic previously, then of course people have not been able to use magic, so that's a very different situation. So let's move on to weapons, armor and other equipment. It's a good idea to have quality of items somehow affecting the game, just not those level requirements. You could have level requirements for certain techniques to use with certain weapons, for example. Wearing armor, sometimes like in Elder Scrolls Online, for example, it's a skill, but it doesn't really make sense for wearing to be a skill. If an armor is complicated, then it is fairly difficult to put on, but it's not really a skill to use it once it is on, as far as I can tell. I mean, in the real world anyway. More realism makes the game better, so look at what the different kinds of armors and combinations there are, allow the players to use them, having the effects of those different objects, the clothes and armor, whatever. They should have some kind of influence in the story, in the mechanics of the game. For example, they weigh something, and you can't carry unlimited amounts of weight, usually, right? So they also affect mobility in some ways, although I hope these days all game designers are aware that armor does not limit mobility nearly as much as some game designers have thought in the past. And also weapons are not hugely heavy, obviously, really. One thing I've never really seen used in any game, as far as I can remember, is the limitations to hearing and vision and things like that. I think actually, yeah, Dungeons and Dragons probably had some kind of mechanic for this. Wearing a helmet, which is a really good idea if you are going to be in a fight, but that is going to affect your hearing and other things. And also, wearing a lot of armor causes you to heat up quickly, and different kinds of armor probably have different properties in the sense that they protect against different types of damage a bit differently. Exactly how is a bit more difficult to say, but Todd of Todd's Workshop has done a lot of great videos on that subject. I strongly recommend watching them. One really funny thing about how armor is done in many kinds of games, even board games like Descent, Journeys in the Dark, and all kinds of role-playing games, video games, whatever, is that apparently in these games usually armor is a one-size-fits-all type of thing, which is nonsensical, of course. Especially if you think about something like plate armor, as in late medieval and early modern European plate armor made of steel plates. They really have to be rather well fitted for the person wearing them. A dwarf wearing the armor stolen from a giant, or vice versa, makes very little sense, but is what you can actually do in these games. So think about that a little bit before using those in your games. Also, for example, shields in some games, like most role-playing games on computers are based on Dungeons and Dragons, and they have different types of shields, and those have different protective properties, which makes sense. But the size of the shield is very different to, say, a halfling and a giant. An ogre could have something like a buckler that would be maybe like a great shield for a halfling, like in Lord of the Rings. The sword Frodo uses is actually a dagger made by the elves, but for Frodo it's the size of a sword. You need to think about these, of course, when designing these games, and actually even Dungeons and Dragons in the earlier editions had some rules about these things. Not perhaps realistic rules, but anyway. In some games you can even swim in full plate armor, harness, even though plate mail, if you call it that, is not nearly as cumbersome as perhaps some people even still think. It still is not really a swimsuit. So in Elder Scrolls Online, for example, you can indefinitely swim in full plate armor, but that makes no sense. one thing about all kinds of gear, especially weapons of various kinds, and even armor and things like that, that you can use in battle, it's kind of strange how in most games the player can loot these things from their enemies, but why then didn't those enemies use those weapons against the player characters? Like, that makes no sense. It should be possible, especially for weapons, but also other things, to break in the game, and it should also be possible to repair them. And some games actually have these options. Finally, it is just really annoying, and it actually, I think, reduces the enjoyment from the game when you just constantly have to use all kinds of potions and magic and whatever just to be able to advance in the story and the bleeding dungeon or whatever. That is really bad for the story, for the experience of playing the game. Again, the less you have of those strange things, the more important they are to the player even. The more significant they are to the experience. You only have one magic ring in Lord of the Rings, for example. Oh well, okay, you have several, but only one is really significantly in the story. And for a good reason. It is used sometimes, and whenever it is used, it's a big deal. If you constantly have to drink 7 different potions and cast 9 different spells just to be able to beat your next enemy, then it just becomes mechanical and boring and annoying. So let's move on to video game mechanics. For example, Elder Scrolls Online has a limited quest inventory, meaning the number of different quests you can have active at any given moment. And that's just, it makes no sense. The player should be able to pick up any number of stupid quests they want to. It's not for the game designers to choose how many the player wants to be handling at once. The inventory of the game is also kind of weird in Elder Scrolls Online, where you don't have any kind of weight limitations, but you have a limitation on the number of items. That again makes no sense. Games these days have far more realistic options of like where you carry whatever things, and that's how it should be. You should not be able to pack 5 different full metal harnesses in your backpack, for example. That's insane. Carrying stuff and fighting while carrying all that stuff certainly should have some kind of influence in the mechanics. Defending by parrying, by the way, yeah, that should be the norm. That's how you defend. You don't roll around in the ground, as ridiculously is done in a lot of games. It's very annoying in games, whether they are role-playing games or like shooting games, when there are very simple obstacles in the game and an ordinary human could actually overcome those obstacles, but somehow the player character is unable to do that. I mean, like moving furniture. Like anyone can kick a stool out of the way or just walk over it. But in a lot of video games, unfortunately, the tiniest things can prevent the player character from moving. It should be possible to climb over a fallen tree or up a small slope or whatever. It should always be possible. Okay, I understand it's perhaps difficult to program this, but it should be possible to use the various terrain for your benefit, as well as the furniture and other objects that you find. So if you want to pick up a chair and use that in fighting, then fine, you should be able to do that, although not very effectively probably. I guess some games have something like this. You can maybe pick up plates and throw them or something, but yeah, it makes the game world more interesting if there is more to interact with. That's, I guess, the main point. Stealth is unfortunately pretty much always badly done. The ambient noise should always have an effect. Most recently I've been playing Sniper Elite 5, where the most annoying thing is that the tank crews, while driving the Tiger tank or whatever it is, can apparently hear everything around the tank as if they were just standing around there quietly. Those tanks actually make a lot of noise, and there's no way anyone inside the tank, even the captain on top of the tank, could hear someone running behind the tank, for example. So, you know, consider these things when you are making a video game. But try to figure out how to realistically implement some kind of hearing to the NPCs there, because usually in games they are either too keen or too dull of hearing. Also, the way they react to different sounds is kind of stupid usually. Kind of mechanical, but I guess in some games that's intentional. Usually in games, although Sniper Elite kind of is different in this regard, but usually in games the non-play characters don't even realize that their friends are disappearing from around, and they just keep on patrolling as if nothing weird is going on. That should not be the case. In a lot of classic role-playing games, the player characters are forced to explore dungeons room by room, which again makes no sense, because how come the characters in the next room never are aware of what's going on in the room just behind the door close by? Bodies should not vanish, and it should be possible to move those bodies. And again, a lot of games these days allow this, which is nice. But the effects of things like explosions should remain in the area, for example charred ground or whatever, and that should be something that guards, for example, should pay attention to. Like, why is a room completely blown up or something? I'm probably going to be unusual compared to the average gamer, but in my opinion, combat tends to be really boring. It's usually repetitive, and there's just far too much of it. Again, too much of something just causes inflation. Combat should be dangerous and therefore important and interesting, and something that you need to be vested in. Just constantly fighting like you do, for example, in Elder Scrolls Online, is just unbelievably boring. Especially if the combat mechanics themselves are really boring. The idea often used in video games where you have to fight all kinds of wild animals is especially stupid, because no wild animal would realistically behave that way. That's one of the things that makes combat boring. Unrealistic combat in general is very boring. Combat that lasts for a long time, whatever it is, maybe melee rounds or actual just minutes that you have to play and try to stab someone 75 times before they even fall to the ground. It makes no sense, you know. It should be over pretty quickly. That makes for far more interesting combat. Pretty much all games have the really stupid lack of psychology in combat, in that almost all games have the enemies, whatever they are, fighting to the death. In reality, a wild animal, or any kind of animal really, would flee given the opportunity when they realize that they are against someone tough. Some maybe would fight to the death, but usually Why would they? Especially wild animals. And soldiers, even professional soldiers, would try to flee or surrender. There are some very rare games where enemies try to surrender, so that should be an option. Games these days unfortunately have these daily events and things like that. All this crap should go. Nobody, well, okay, I don't like that. It messes up the suspension of disbelief. I mean, you can have something that makes sense in the game world. If it makes sense in the game world, if it's internally consistent, then I'm okay with it. But if it's something like daily in our real world, that should not be a thing in the game world. It should not affect the game world, especially in role-playing games. But in my opinion, all good games are role-playing games. So I find it difficult to understand that I even have to say this, but save game options should always be included in video games, and also quick save and quick load options. But even saving using a specific name that you can type yourself, that should always be an option. One last thing. First person view is far superior to third person view because of the immersion, for example. You don't see yourself from behind, do you? Usually you should, in my opinion at least, have the option to play from first person point of view. In a lot of games that have a third person view, the things in the game actually come between the player and the player character, so you don't see the character you are playing, and that makes no sense. How can you then control the character? I think Assassin's Creed games, the more recent ones, have done away with this in a nice way. Actually, there's one bonus thing. The game Prey, I think, uses a very nice mechanic which I kind of hoped for about 10 years ago already, or maybe even earlier. In darkness, things really close to the character you're playing should be gray, because if you are actually somewhere in a dark place, you have your senses, you are aware of things nearby, or at least you can be aware of them to some extent using your hands, for example, at least. So instead of just having blackness, you can have grayness there to kind of tell the player that now it is really dark, but nearby you can still be aware of these things. That's all I wanted to say. I hope somebody learned something from this. I hope this is a list of things that I will see in future games corrected. I don't think that's gonna happen. If you actually did watch this long, I'm surprised, but thank you, seriously. Bye for now. If you wish to support my channel, please click thumbs up, subscribe and share my videos. Any comments on the videos would also be welcome.